Yama Yama. I'm Mitch Tambo, a proud Gamilaroi man, and it's an honour and a blessing to be here before you all tonight. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my utmost respect to the true owners and caretakers of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. For you are the first mothers, fathers, doctors, lawkeepers, agriculturalists, caretakers, and much, much more. For your law transcends the physical and shines throughout the Wadumbil, the Milky Way, flows through the Bugeye, the rivers and waterways, and Ulugis dances through the beautiful wind across this country. I'd like to acknowledge your elders, caretakers and youth, along with all elders, caretakers and youth across this nation. And may you be respected and uplifted always. And may the love of my family and people be with you all. So with that said, welcome to Q&A.
Hi there, and welcome to the program. Joining me on the panel tonight, Mitch Tambo, who will perform for us a little later on. Author and academic, Randa Abdel-Fattah. Liberal member for Wentworth and former ambassador to Israel, Sharma. International human rights lawyer, Jennifer Robinson. And Labor member for Chifley, Husic. Please make all of them feel welcome.
So, with the recent outbreak in Victoria, have we failed in our vaccine program, considering that we are still fighting spot outbreaks and contact tracing can really only work so far to stop the spread?
Husic.
Where to start? Certainly not with the COVID Safe app. I'd have to say that complacency has been the big enemy here. Complacency by the federal government in securing the vaccine supplies required, complacency and responsibility shifting to the states on quarantine. Now, a few weeks ago, right in this chair, I think Dr. Norman Swan outlined how Pfizer approached the federal government in June last year saying, let's do a deal. There were initial discussions in July and nothing happened, and the deal was not sorted until November. Now, we were told we'd be in the front of the queue. We were told we'd have 4 million people vaccinated by March. Then it became October, and now we don't know when it's actually going to happen because they're not going to commit to targets. The biggest thing we need people to be safe. We need people to feel secure. They're going to get that more if they know that the vaccines are available and are out there, and there's a sense of urgency to get this done.
Are you saying, though, the vaccine program has failed? That's the question.
Yeah, I think, well, by all accounts, I mean, most people would appreciate that because we haven't really vaccinated that many people, 1.7% in Australia. I hate to bring up the comparison because we do this so often. Kazakhstan, 5%. If you look in the States, 40%, and they had Donald Trump slowing that down, and then they've obviously changed gear, shifted gear.
But reaching record numbers of daily doses now, I mean, we are... The rollout is ramping up very clearly, very obviously.
Well, I think, let me put it to you this way, Hamish. If you're in Victoria right now, you would have wished that this was going faster. And you would have also wished that we'd had a quarantine system that can cope with the emerging variants that are coming up now, where we've got aerosol-based. Instead of droplet, we've got aerosol, and the issue is hotel quarantine is not capable, is not meant to deal with this. So we do need to get a serious move on these two issues.
Mitch Tambo, you're from Melbourne. You got up in good time yesterday. How does it feel to have your home state going back into lockdown again?
Hamish, it's a real kick. You know, we really felt the brunt of it last year. We were in lockdown for, it felt like almost half the year. And I feel like for all of us in Victoria, you know, we feel like we've got our life back. You know, we're moving forward, work's busy, and then all of a sudden you wake up and again the calendar's empty and you don't know what's next, you know. But in saying that, I feel like we just have to do everything we can to maintain our health, look after community, and hopefully abide by the rules and get through winter, because I think that's the thing we're all concerned about is, you know, winter's not even officially here yet, and here we are on the dawn of another, you know, potential 3-4 months in lockdown.
Sharma, if the vaccine rollout was on schedule as promised by your government, we wouldn't be in this situation, would we?
I don't agree there, Hamish. I mean, the vaccine provides protection against the disease, but so do a number of other measures we have in place. We've got the border restrictions, we've got hotel quarantine, we've got testing and contact tracing, and we've got physical distancing. And it's important to remember that we need multiple layers to protect ourselves from this disease. Now, on the vaccination program, the numbers yesterday were 3.9 million Australians who received their first vaccination. 105,000 Australians received a vaccination yesterday.
And that's an interesting statistic because actually that's close to 4 million, which your government promised to have delivered by the end of March. We're now towards the end of May. I mean, we are a really long way behind schedule.
Well, there's undoubtedly been slippage, but I mean, I'd point out the AstraZeneca vaccine, for instance. We contracted 3.8 million doses of those. We've only been able to get 700,000 of those. India has gone offline as a producer of vaccines and other materials because they've had their own pandemic to deal with. I don't think it's realistic to expect that there aren't going to be hiccups and obstacles along this pathway. But the point is that we adjust, we iterate, and we move on to the next phase. Now, where we are now, I mean, more doses are coming into Australia. We've got deals with Pfizer, with Moderna. We've got AstraZeneca coming online as well. I'm confident we'll get this done, but it is a reminder. I mean, look, in the United States, high vaccination rate, they had 25,000 new cases yesterday, 600 plus deaths. In the United Kingdom, 2,500 new cases yesterday. High levels of vaccination are important, but they're not a cure-all. We're going to need to keep a whole lot of other policy measures in place for some considerable time yet.
Jennifer Robinson?
I mean, border closures are not an answer and certainly not a long-term answer. The bungle that this has been is not only negligent, but it's going to cost Australian lives and has already cost Australian lives. And border closures aren't a long-term solution. We've got 36,000 Australians stranded overseas who aren't able to come home, which is unlawful. Human Rights Committee has already made provisional measures against Australia saying it's unlawful that Australians aren't able to come home. And that's because we don't have sufficient facilities. And nor does this government have a proper plan for that.
Dave?
I accept entirely that border closures have caused a significant degree of personal and other hardship to any number of people, including lots in my own electorate and, you know, close personal friends of mine. But the truth is that Australia has been one of a suite of measures that has meant that we've come through this pandemic on any objective measure a whole lot better than any other country in the world. I mean, we've had 910 deaths in Australia. About 800 of those were from the second wave in Victoria last year. Every one of those deaths is a tragedy and regrettable. But when you look at the numbers in the United States, over 600,000 deaths. In the United Kingdom, over 250,000 deaths. If we had anything like that here in Australia, we'd be talking about 20 to 30,000 of our fellow citizens who would have lost their lives.
Ed?
But this is the complacency that I'm speaking about. There's no sense of urgency. There's no, you know, we don't have a mass information campaign urging people to go out and get the vaccination because our belief is that by the borders being closed, she'll be right. And this is not a good public health strategy. We need to have, we had a health minister that was saying you can get your vaccination now or you can wait till later. Wink, like waiting for someone else to, maybe another type of vaccination to come in because there's been hesitancy in terms of getting vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I just think, one, as I said, we need to have really a firm commitment out of the government to encourage people to get vaccine. We need to get quarantine sorted out. We need to get the vaccine production and manufacture here done. And the other thing is too, I genuinely worry, we're a relatively small nation. We've got the benefit of being an island continent and we're shutting ourselves off from the rest of the world as they're getting their act together. And we know the economic, but also what this does to us socially in terms of being closed off from the rest of the world. I don't think this is a good long-term prescription for the nation, and we do need to get our act together on this sooner rather than later.
Randa, according to the 7-day rolling average, which is about 73,000 doses currently, noting though that today we're well above that, it'd take something like 19 months more to roll this out across Australia. Do you see it as a failure?
Yeah, I do, and I think that, you know, we pride ourselves and we like to co-opt the idea of being a multicultural society when it suits us politically. And then we forget the fact that there are so many Australians who have family overseas, who are connected with people overseas, who haven't seen their mothers, people who are having children here, who haven't, their grandparents haven't seen their children, who are desperate to be able to be reunited with their families. And that always gets missing from the debate, as though border closures are the answer, where it affects so many.
But there is broad support for the border closures, isn't there?
But when you speak to, of course there is broad support simple in terms of the short term, but it can't be a long-term solution here. It needs to be something that, like Ed said, there has to be a sense of urgency to these measures.
But the border closures, haven't they kept vulnerable Australian communities, remote Indigenous communities, safe throughout the course of this pandemic? You know, the predictions were that remote Indigenous communities could be wiped out if the pandemic reached there.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I'm talking about is when you have, for example, racially selective returns of citizens, Australian citizens. We have citizens in India who are not allowed to return, but we did not have the same sort of measures applied to citizens coming back from the UK and America. And to think that our communities aren't noticing those discrepancies and aren't seeing the racialisation of the way that these policies are impacting on multicultural communities, I think we need to think about and talk about that as well.
Dave Sharma, you do want borders open as soon as possible, don't you?
I do, but it's going to need to be in a way that's consistent with protecting the public health of Australians and consistent with the medical advice. I mean, what Ed didn't mention here is these policies have been agreed by the National Cabinet, state premiers, Labor and Liberal, and the Prime Minister on the basis of medical advice, the chief health officers and the chief medical officers of the states and territories. So, I mean, you know, if we got advice saying that it was safe to open the borders, of course I'd listen to the experts, but that is clearly not the advice right now. And I think most Australians...
But might that advice be different if a very significant proportion of the population was vaccinated?
Absolutely.
If 70 or 80% of the population
Absolutely.
was vaccinated, that advice would change.
Absolutely, and I don't think there's any intent on behalf of the government or certainly anyone in the parliament to keep borders closed for any longer than necessary. You know, there's a review that is underway.
Or maybe until after an election is held.
I don't think there's any linkage there at all. I mean, I don't think that our doctors or our chief medical officers give their advice depending on where we are in the political cycle. I think they're thorough professionals. And we'll take their advice. But obviously, high levels of vaccination will help us open the borders quicker. Diminishment of the disease overseas will help us open the borders quicker, and the risk profile of the country where we're hoping to open the borders with. I mean, we've got a travel bubble that's been open with New Zealand. It's now closed for Victorians and others. I'd hope we can start selectively opening some other ones. But again, it will have to depend very much on where the disease is at the time. And anyone who thinks the pathway out of this is linear just needs to look back and see how many setbacks we've had all along the way, not just in Australia, but worldwide. And I think it pays in those circumstances to, you know, not set in stone where you think you're going to be. Certainly always be hoping to open the borders quicker, but we need to be responsive and we need to adapt to what the conditions require.
My son lives in Israel and works with the International Committee of the Red Cross. When the Hamas missiles were being fired at Tel Aviv, he was messaging us that he and his wife were okay in their tiny, safe room. His dog was totally distressed. My son goes down regularly to the Sderot and the other places on the Gaza border for the Red Cross. Why is the suffering of innocent civilians being attacked, innocent Israeli civilians being attacked, and the Hamas being ignored?
Randa, Abdel-Fattah.
I'm so happy that your son has a safe house to go to. If only Gazans had the opportunity to escape, the most densely populated place in the entire world, and it's been under a blockade by Israel for 14 years, cut off from the rest of Palestine. It got absolutely no freedom of movement. And so when you have a military power backed and funded by the US, $3.8 billion a year, you have the state-of-the-art advanced weapons dropping bombs on civilians, and you're talking to me about the safety of Israelis? Where are Palestinians in Gaza supposed to go to? Your son's puppy, your son's dog was scared. There are children who were massacred and slaughtered. 9 Palestinian families have been wiped off the civil registry. Just yesterday, there was a tweet about that. 9 Palestinian families no longer exist, obliterated. And you're talking to me about Israeli safety? Israel has state-of-the-art weapons defence system and missile defence system. Where do Palestinians go when they are being bombarded by the IDF, by one of the most powerful nuclear powers in the world? Where is their protection? Where are the people there to protect them from that onslaught? And Israel is targeting civilians. Israel, yes, it is targeting civilians. Israel has access to, because it is the occupier, the population registry for Palestine. So it has the names, the ages, the residential addresses of every single Palestinian in Gaza, which is why it can make a phone call to say, we're going to bomb this residential tower at so-and-so time.
Randa, I'm just going to take us back to the question, though, which was about the role of Hamas and the impact on Israeli civilians. We've got a few questions on this. Dave Sharma, could I ask you for a response to that question?
Well, look, I mourn the loss of life on both sides of this conflict, innocent civilians on both sides of this conflict. Every loss of life is regrettable on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, and many people have suffered through this conflict. In my view, needlessly, this wasn't a conflict that needed to happen.
Why did it happen?
The proximate cause was that Hamas started to fire rockets at Israeli civilian populations. And that's really, there have been 5 conflicts. Since Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, there have been at least 5 conflicts between Hamas and Israel. And they've almost one started because an Israeli soldier was kidnapped and abducted, Gilad Shalit. Many others have started because of rocket fire from Hamas. I can't understand why Hamas does this, because it knows the response, as the response of any nation would be if its own population was taking rocket fire, would be to hit back at the sources of the rocket strikes. In Australia, if we were taking rocket fire here, I expect our population would be calling our political leadership and saying, what are you doing to stop this? It's that Israel has a right to self-defence. They don't choose to initiate a conflict with Hamas. They didn't initiate this conflict with Hamas. I think it's regrettable Hamas did so, but it's been to the detriment, certainly, of the Gazan civilian population, without doubt, and the Israeli population too.
When you say Israel has a right to self-defence, what you're actually asking us to embrace as a proposition is that an occupier and a coloniser, a state that is based on a racial apartheid system...
I don't accept any of those characterisations.
Well, the most prestigious human rights organisation, Human Rights Watch, found in its report last month that Israel is practising apartheid.
I think, to be clear, they talked about a form of apartheid. I mean, they weren't calling it an apartheid state.
Hamish, if Palestinian intellectuals, activists, lawyers have for years been recording, and Israeli human rights organisations, that Israel is a settler apartheid state. It is an apartheid state that preferences one racial group over another. It is infused in every single aspect of its legal processes, its ethnic cleansing, its depopulation processes, its military occupation, its brutal military occupation in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Gaza, its brutal siege on Palestinians in Gaza. Even it affects Palestinians in the diaspora. My father is here today. He's older than the State of Israel. He was born in 1945. He has experienced 3 Nakbas, 1948, exiled in 1967, and today the ongoing Nakba. He cannot return to his house, which is still there, because he is a Palestinian. When we return as a Palestinian, we have to go there on our Australian passport, and we're at the mercy of a soldier, a conscript, who will decide whether we can enter. He gave us 3 days the last visit. Any Jewish person in this audience today automatically has a right to return and live in my father's birthplace. Don't tell me that's not apartheid.
Jen Robinson.
I have to agree with Randa. And it's one thing, Dave, to say that Israel has the ability to respond to rocket strikes, but in such a disproportionate and indiscriminate manner. If we look at the figures, just from the most recent conflict in the past month, something like 248 Palestinians have been killed, including 66 children. Israel has been indiscriminately targeting journalists, the bombing of media organisations. This is a deliberate attack on media freedom and also the ability of the world to understand what is happening on the ground. I've been working with the International Federation of Journalists working on the issue of the targeting of journalists, and there is case after case of people wearing clear press vests being sniped in the context of the Great March. Unbelievable targeting. It is not correct to say that Israel is right and is using the appropriate use of force in response to what Hamas has been doing. This is an unlawfully occupied people who have suffered great disadvantage, discrimination and human rights violations. There is a definition under international law of apartheid. Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, other Israeli human rights groups agree that it meets that definition. And it's time that the Australian government starts taking appropriate action. I am continually embarrassed by the conduct of the Australian government at the Human Rights Council, at the Security Council, voting against every single attempt for human rights accountability for what Israel and Hamas are doing. If the Australian government is so concerned about Hamas bombings, then why did we oppose the International Criminal Court having jurisdiction to look into the crimes of both sides of the conflict?
Let's let Dave respond to that.
I don't pretend the answers are easy here, but And I'm not here as the spokesperson for Israel, for that matter. I'm here as an Australian parliamentarian who's here as a representative of Australia. But having lived in the region, I can tell you that firstly, things are not as clear-cut as they might seem. Israel has not been in Gaza since 2005. They withdrew from Gaza. Shortly after Israel withdrew, Hamas took over Gaza. Hamas is committed to, in its own charter, to the destruction of the State of Israel and to imposing Islamic law upon what was historically the territory of Palestine. They're perfectly free to do that, but they're a listed terrorist organisation. Now, in my own experience, and this is certainly true of the Palestinian political leadership in the West Bank, Fattah, they would like to have a two-state solution. They support a negotiated two-state solution, but Hamas does not in Gaza. They've never accepted Israel's right to exist. They've never agreed to abide by previous peace agreements, such as the Oslo agreements, and they've never disavowed the use of terrorism as a tool. Now, and until such time as the Palestinian political leadership can be reunified in some way, or that Hamas agrees to a political settlement to this conflict, I think it's difficult for Israel to unilaterally solve this one.
You know, it's not a conflict between Israel and Hamas. Hamas is not in the West Bank. Hamas is not part of the Palestinians who are living as second-class citizens in Israel. I mean, this is a constant. You've just basically ticked off every Hasbara argument of this Israeli lobby. The idea that, first of all, it's our fault that we are occupied. It's our fault that we haven't got a peace agreement. It's our fault. It's Hamas's fault that we are being bombed. Always putting the onus back on Palestinians when it is Israel who is the occupier. It is Israel who is instituting a brutal occupation in the West Bank, in Gaza, and don't tell me that Israel withdrew. Gaza has been under military siege for 14 years. Nobody can leave. There is no freedom of movement, of medicine, of goods.
I'd love to hear your solution. What's your solution?
I just actually want to broaden this conversation out to the rest of the panel. Mitch, I'm interested, without asking you to wade into the detail of all of this, how do you observe it? How do you watch a conflict like this unfold? We are talking about occupation, we are talking about people in the traditional lands, historic lands, religious beliefs and their connection with place. How do you view it?
Look, first and foremost, I'm not a political man, but, you know, I'm a man, I think, that tries to operate through his heart and spirit. And, you know, I feel like I don't know enough, but, you know, where there's innocent lives being lost and talk of, it's not apartheid, it's just elements of apartheid. It's not cool, you know. Obviously, I can relate on different multitudes because of historically what's happened here with our people and the ongoing genocide that is still current here today that we don't always like to hit front on and, you know, say what it is, you know, and over-representations. And I feel like it comes a time where us as human beings, we need to come together and look past religion and all of these things that we use to divide us and not use to actually come together and love and accept. Because at the end of the day, in, you know, Palestine, young people are dying, I'm sure in Israel too, but it comes back to the occupier. And if it's really geared, is it colonisation? Are we trying to wipe out a culture here? You know, that's not okay. And I mean, look at, you know, 250 kilometres off the shore of Australia and you talk about West Papua, I bet 90% of people in here don't even know what is going on there. There's a media blackout there. You know, there's 60,000 unaccounted lives since 2018. There's the largest gold mine on the planet, second largest rainforest. It's absolutely been raped of its resources. The Australian government has done heaps of stuff with the Indonesian military, and yet that military is doing things and committing acts of genocide. I mean, that's a shorter trip for those that don't understand. To get from the top of Australia to West Papua, it's shorter than Sydney to Canberra, and we don't know anything about it. So, I mean, there is things happening everywhere that's absolutely horrific, and it's all genocide, and it's all about control and occupation, and it's all about dominance. And there comes a time where we have to come together and say enough's enough, because you know what, we are losing kids day after day. Here, every day we lose our kids. We've got some of the highest rates of suicide in the planet, over-incarceration, domestic violence, you know, the list goes on, deaths in custody. And these things are happening over here in Palestine, you know, West Papua, it goes on and on and on. And it comes a time where we have to put the guns down, so to speak, and just go, you know what, we have to come up with a solution here because we can't let any more lives be lost, you know.
And what you said,
bloodshed.
Mitch, is connected. Everything that you just said now is connected by one thread, and that is settler colonialism. When you're talking about West Papua, when you're talking about Australia, when you're talking about Palestine. And Dave, you asked me what the solution is, and it's not this is not complicated. That is often used as an excuse, and it's used as an excuse to say it's too difficult, we're just going to accept the status quo, which is basically asking Palestinians to relinquish their basic human rights. It's asking Palestinians to embrace a status quo where they are second-class citizens, where they must accept being subjugated and oppressed and repressed and not being able to live with dignity the way we all expect that we are allowed to be able to live with dignity. So when you say, what is the solution? The solution is impose sanctions on Israel. Make injustice a bad investment. Impose sanctions, impose an arms embargo, implement the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement.
But with a view to a two-state solution, is that your suggested model?
A two-state solution is something Israel doesn't even want. Through its illegal settlements...
I'm just trying to understand.
No, I don't, because it's impossible.
So what do you want?
I want one state where every human being is treated equally. And I want... What is so radical about that?
I don't think that the Palestinians want one state, and I don't think the Israelis want one state
well,
either.
Israelis, we know, don't, because the majority of Israelis and their governments
I would be hesitant to impose upon people something that they're not asking for themselves.
Israel is the occupier. Okay. Israel is in an illegal occupation. So before we even talk about Randa, what's going to happen once we're free, just set us free first.
It is Reconciliation Week. Is Australia ready to hear its own truth? Are we brave enough to learn the atrocities that have happened in the past and the present? There's deaths in custody, children being removed. It's happening right now a faster rate today. The gap's not closing. So my question is, how will Australia find its heart?
Mitch.
Why'd you pick me, Haim? No, look, to be honest, great question. And I feel like I can only hope that, you know, we just get into schools. I feel like we have to educate the kids, you know, and educate the teachers. You know, I hear numerous stories from kids about the remarks from teachers in schools as well. So I think it's important that we educate teachers, we educate educators, and we get to the kids, because the reality is that's where we've got a greater scope to build capacity, build empathy, build a heart that's geared towards hearing our story, sitting with us and hearing our truths. You know, we can't turn our head away anymore to the truths of what happened here. And it's not to point fingers, and I don't come from that position, because I want to bring us all together so we can heal. I'm crying out for healing for my people, because we hear this term all the time, you're resilient, but that doesn't mean we want to be resilient, we want to be free. We want to be trauma-free. This transgenerational trauma stuff, it is scientifically proven that it can be passed on through the DNA. It is real. So to answer your question, I hope with all of my heart that we are coming to a position in this nation where we can stop turning our head away, open our hearts, and just grow a little bit of capacity for our story. Because the truth is the stolen generations, the majority of it, and when I say these words, it's not to trigger any of the old people that were taken, they weren't necessarily birthed out of love. Our women were raped and absolutely bastardised. And here we sit today with our women like 35 to 80 times more likely to be hospitalised due to domestic violence. That's our women. There's nothing more royal or sacred on this planet than our women. We are from the oldest living continual culture on the planet, and we are so overrepresented in this hell of domestic violence, and it starts as a root where we have to go to. And in order to face that root, we have to hit it front on and go, you know what, I didn't do it. But rather than turn away and go, that's not my fault, I'm not sorry, it's like a brother's, sister's, friend's, brother's, auntie's, uncle passed away and you heard about it and you go, you know what, are you okay? I'm really sorry that happened. I'm going to empathise with you. I'm going to open up my heart and give you a hug because I'm sorry. Let's talk about it. You know, our people are dying in jails, overrepresented in incarceration. We make up 3%. There was a statistic the other day that, you know, 41% of in-out-of-home care of our kids that are in foster care and whatnot are Aboriginal that make up that percentage. 41%. You know, it's growing. Our kids are still being taken away. We've got a new generation of stolen generations. You know, we're dying, we're killing ourselves. We're absolutely riddled in chronic disease and illness. You're going out into remote communities, there's inadequate human resources, the list goes on. And I'm not here to point and condemn and point out all these negativities, but I am here to cry out and say, please empathise with us. Please get on our story. Please listen to our story, because we need you. We need everyone you know, and we all need to come together and love and accept one another, regardless of race, religion, gender, sexuality and class. Because you know what, our young people need all of you, because our young people are killing themselves. Our young people are dying every day. Our women are getting bashed every day. And that's not me condemning my Aboriginal brothers, because our women are with all men from all walks of life, and it's not okay, and we have to put an end to it. Our people are dying of type 2 diabetes, and we sit and we talk about type 2 diabetes like it's a common cold. You know, our people out in remote communities are spending more time hooked up to dialysis than being out there in the bush and being connected and healing. So what we need is to grow capacity for our story. And there'll be people here tonight that will comment and they'll go, you're not really a black fella, look at you, look at your skin, what are you, 1% in your finger? It's not about that, it's about our spirit. It's about what's inside of our heart, our ghee dewey, our heart and our spirit. There's so many mob like me that are this colour because of our past, the stolen generations, and because of the obvious. Our parents get together and they marry from different nationalities because of this beautiful culture that we've got here. But what you can't take away is our spirit, the resilience of our ancestors, they're here. So to answer your question, we must come together. You know, we're in the final hour and we need each and every single one of you from every walk of life so we can journey together into a greater future.
Mitch, you're so powerful, you're setting off the alarm in the building. Would you please thank our wonderful panel, Mitch Tambo, Randa Abdel-Fattah, Dave Sharma, Jennifer Robinson and Ed Husic.